Major Elena Reyes stood at the edge of the peace negotiation room, watching 27-year-old Lieutenant James Mitchell execute what he considered a flawless diplomatic exchange. The conference table gleamed with polished wood and digital tablets while Mitchell's confident voice filled the room. Perfect approach, clear boundaries established. Time to resolution, 36 minutes flat, Mitchell announced, stepping away from the simulation with the swagger that only came with youth and inexperience. At 42, Elena had seen that swagger before. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. She'd worn it herself once, back when she believed force and ultimatums could solve everything. Before Operation Olive Branch. Before she learned that some conflicts could only be resolved by understanding what others couldn't see. "Not bad, Lieutenant," Elena said, her voice steady but distant. "But what happens when your counterpart has lost family in the conflict and refuses to speak to you at all?" Mitchell exchanged a glance with his fellow officers, barely concealing a smirk. "Ma'am, with respect, modern conflict resolution doesn't work that way anymore. We have psychological profiles, cultural analysts, and AI-generated negotiation tactics. If someone won't talk, we escalate to authorized pressure points." Elena nodded slowly, her weathered hands clasped behind her back. She'd heard variations of this speech for 4 years now, ever since General Wallace had reassigned her from active combat operations to the Diplomatic Training Division. The official report had been kind, exemplary service record transitioning to educational leadership role. The unofficial truth was simpler. After Olive Branch, nobody wanted the officer who negotiated peace when orders were to neutralize. "Run the simulation again," she said quietly. "This time, imagine your translator has provided incorrect information, and your counterpart believes you've just threatened their children." "Ma'am, respectfully, when would that ever happen in actual field operations?" This came from Lieutenant Rivera, fresh from the Advanced Strategic Operations School, his uniform still crisp with that new officer's sheen. The question hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. When would that happen? Lena's fingers unconsciously traced the small scar on her left wrist, a souvenir from the day she'd walked alone into an enemy stronghold after a miscommunication had derailed official peace talks. The day she'd negotiated the surrender of an entire insurgent faction using nothing but empathy and cultural understanding, because every piece of advanced intelligence had proven catastrophically wrong. "Just run it again," she said. After the session, Elena walked alone across the frost-covered grounds of Fort Concordia. The December wind cut through her service jacket, but she welcomed the cold. It kept her sharp, reminded her that comfort was a luxury peacekeepers couldn't afford. Her footsteps echoed between the administration buildings until she reached Building 7, where her old office waited. Compared to the sleek diplomatic simulation rooms with their holographic displays and real-time translation technology, her space looked ancient. Worn leather chairs, bookshelves filled with texts in a dozen languages, and walls covered with photographs of people she'd helped during 2 decades of service. But it was still functional, still reliable, still the place where she'd prepared for the mission that had brought peace when nothing else could. Pinned to the wall beside her desk, barely visible unless you knew where to look, was a handwritten note in faded ink. Humanity before victory. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd achieved victory through humanity, but not by choice, never by choice. Still talking to those old memories, Major, Elena turned to find Master Sergeant David Torres approaching, a coffee cup steaming in his hands. Torres was one of the few people on base who'd been there before Olive Branch, who remembered when Major Elena Reyes was the officer everyone wanted leading their peacekeeping operations. "They're good company," Elena replied. "Don't tell me I'm outdated." Torres laughed, but it was hollow. "You know, I pulled the incident reports on the new psychological tactics yesterday. Impressive technology, don't get me wrong, but in the past 6 months we've had 14 major communication breakdowns. Minor stuff mostly, but still. 14 failures in 6 months. And how many with traditional diplomatic approaches? 3. All cultural misunderstandings, nothing catastrophic." Torres took a sip of his coffee. "Makes you wonder if newer is always better." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the morning sun paint the mountains in shades of orange and gold. Somewhere in those peaks was the Corinth Valley, a name that had been appearing more frequently in intelligence briefings lately. Contested territory, the report said. High-value diplomatic targets. You ever miss it? Torres asked. Real missions, not just teaching kids how to read cultural briefings. Elena was quiet for a long moment. The honest answer was complicated. She missed the clarity of diplomatic missions, the simple equation of bringing people to an agreement and saving lives. She missed being trusted with something that mattered. But she didn't miss the weight of command, the responsibility for other people's lives. Every day, she said finally. Torres nodded, understanding. For what it's worth, Major, some of us remember. Some of us know what you did out there. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. After he left, Elena sat at her desk, the chair molded to her body like an old glove. Every item arranged exactly where her muscle memory expected them to be. She pulled out a small wooden box from the bottom drawer, the same box she'd carried on every mission for the past 10 years. Inside was a handwritten journal, pages yellowed and edges worn soft from handling. The paper was stained with what looked like coffee but was actually blood from that terrible day in 2018. Actual grains of sand still clung to the corners, souvenirs from a desert that had claimed too many good soldiers. The journal contained notes she'd written about the Tariq people, not the official intelligence reports, but the desperate, improvised observations she'd made when everything went wrong. When cultural intelligence failed, when translation systems died, when the region's complex tribal allegiances turned their advanced conflict resolution systems into expensive paperweights, these notes had saved hundreds of lives once. She had a feeling they might need to again. The morning briefing droned on with the usual routine. Security reports, training schedules, intelligence updates. Elena sat in the back row, half listening while younger officers discussed their latest simulations and theoretical scenarios. The confidence in their voices reminded her of herself at their age, back when she thought surviving the academy meant she was ready for anything. Major Reyes, General Wallace's voice cut through her thoughts. I assume you have nothing to add to today's tactical discussion. The question carried an edge, a subtle reminder of her place in the hierarchy. She was here to observe, to teach basic diplomatic principles to cadets, not to contribute to real operational planning. No, sir, she replied evenly. Nothing to add. But as she looked around the room at the faces of officers who'd never seen real conflict, who'd never watched their intelligence fail at the worst possible moment, who'd never had to choose between following orders and saving lives, Elena realized she had everything to add. They just weren't ready to listen. Not yet. The emergency klaxon shattered the morning quiet at 0600 hours sharp. Elena bolted upright in her quarters, instincts honed by years of peacekeeping operations kicking in before she was fully awake. Within 90 seconds she was dressed, heading toward the command center, muscle memory guiding her through the corridors of Fort Concordia. The scene in the command center was controlled chaos. Officers moved with practiced urgency between banks of monitors and communication stations. At the center of it all stood General Wallace, his silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour, reviewing what appeared to be mission parameters on a large tactical display. Diplomatic Team Alpha 3 is missing, Colonel Janet Walsh announced to the assembled officers. Last contact was 36 hours ago deep in Corinth Valley. Intel suggests they've been compromised and are being held by the Tariq faction. Elena felt her pulse quicken. Corinth Valley was nightmare terrain. Complex tribal allegiances, unpredictable militant factions, and enough cultural complexity to turn the most advanced negotiation systems into expensive decorations. She'd studied those mountains extensively after Operation Olive Branch, recognizing the similarities to the region that had nearly killed her. This is a volunteer mission only, General Wallace continued, his voice carrying the weight of command. High-risk extraction from a contested zone. We need 8 officers for a coordinated diplomatic approach. Hands shot up around the room. Lieutenant Mitchell, Lieutenant Rivera, and 6 other officers from the Elite Strategic Operations Division volunteered immediately. These were the base's golden children, the ones with perfect simulation scores and immaculate service records, unblemished by failure. Elena raised her hand. The room fell silent for a moment. She could hear nothing but the hum of electronic equipment and the distant sound of helicopters warming up on the landing pad. "Major Reyes," General Wallace said, his tone carefully neutral. "I'm sure your instructional expertise would be valuable, but this mission requires officers with current operational experience." "Sir, I have 32 successful diplomatic missions logged, including 4 high-risk extractions in similar cultural terrain," Elena replied, keeping her voice professional despite the implied dismissal. Lieutenant Mitchell cleared his throat. "With respect, Major, those missions were years ago. This operation requires familiarity with current diplomatic protocols and modern negotiation techniques." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the younger officers. To them, her experience was ancient history, irrelevant in an age of AI-assisted cultural analysis and algorithm-guided negotiation strategies. "The mission parameters are set," General Wallace said with finality. "Strategic Operations Division will handle the extraction. Major Reyes, perhaps you could assist with pre-flight briefings for the volunteers." Dismissed. Again relegated to a supporting role while officers half her age prepared to negotiate in territory that had nearly killed her once before. But as she turned to leave, something caught her attention on the tactical display. The proposed approach cut straight through Sector 4, a region marked in yellow for caution. Complex tribal dynamics. To the young officers, it probably looked like the most direct route. To Elena, who had memorized every tribal boundary and cultural nuance in those mountains, it looked like suicide. "Sir," she said, stepping back toward the display. "The approach through Sector 4. "Major," General Wallace interrupted, not looking up from his paperwork. "The mission has been planned by our best tactical analysts, using the most current intelligence available. I'm confident these officers can handle any cultural sensitivities they encounter." The dismissal stung, but it wasn't the words that bothered Elena. It was the absolute certainty in Wallace's voice, the same certainty she'd heard before Operation Olive Branch, when her concerns about cultural misunderstandings had been waved away as unnecessary pessimism. After the briefing, she lingered in the hallway, watching the chosen officers file past toward the preparation rooms. Their confidence was infectious, their camaraderie obvious. They moved like a team that had trained together, fought together, trusted each other completely. She'd had that once, before Olive Branch. "Major Reyes." Elena turned to find Captain Lisa Chen, one of the base's intelligence officers, approaching with a thick folder in her hands. Chen was in her early 30s, career military, with sharp eyes that missed very little. "Captain?" "I was reviewing the mission files and I noticed something interesting." Chen opened the folder, revealing what appeared to be classification records. "Your security clearance is still active at the D1 level." Elena raised an eyebrow. D1 clearance was reserved for officers who had proven themselves capable of operating independently in the highest risk scenarios. She'd earned it after her 3rd successful solo negotiation mission, back when the military still trusted her judgment. "That's unusual," Chen continued. "Most instructors have their operational clearances downgraded, but yours was specifically maintained by order of Pentagon Command. I wasn't aware of that." Chen's expression grew serious. "I pulled your complete service record, Major. Operation Olive Branch, 2018. You were the only officer who successfully negotiated a ceasefire with the Tarek faction, using cultural understanding after complete intelligence failure." The memories came flooding back. The desperate communication, the dead translation devices, the weight of 18 injured soldiers in her responsibility while she negotiated blind through cultural complexities that intelligence had said were impossible. The 3 she couldn't save haunted her dreams, but the 18 who made it home had families who would never know her name. "That was a long time ago, Captain." "Was it?" Chen pulled out another document, because according to this morning's cultural analysis, the faction operating in Sector 4 has the exact same leadership structure as the group you negotiated with in Olive Branch. Same tribal affiliations, same honor codes, same potential for catastrophic misunderstanding if approached incorrectly. Elena stared at the intelligence data, her blood running cold. The patterns were eerily familiar. Tribal structures shifting in ways that would make modern negotiation protocols struggle to compensate. cultural nuances that could turn sophisticated diplomatic systems into dead weight. Have you shared this analysis with General Wallace? Chen's expression told her everything. I tried. He said the new psychological profiling systems are designed to handle any cultural variations we might encounter. He's confident in the technology. Technology, always the answer. Until it wasn't. That evening, Elena found herself in Building 7 again, sitting at her desk, with her old wooden box open beside her. The handwritten journal seemed to glow in the dim light, its faded ink holding secrets that no computer database contained. She traced the cultural notes with her finger, not the direct approach that looked logical on paper, but the winding, seemingly inefficient course that had brought peace when AI analysts couldn't penetrate the cultural complexity. A path that avoided the worst tribal tensions, had used traditional greetings instead of fighting them, that treated cultural differences as an ally instead of an obstacle to overcome. Her radio crackled to life. Major Reyes, this is Control. Please report to General Wallace's office immediately. Elena closed the journal carefully, locked the wooden box, and stood up. Whatever Wallace wanted at this hour, it couldn't be good news. The General's office was spartanly decorated. Military regulations, foundation certificates, and a single photo of him shaking hands with a Pentagon official. Wallace sat behind his desk, reading from a tablet with a kind of expression that suggested he was delivering bad news. Major, I'll be direct. There have been some concerns raised about your suitability for continued service in an instructional capacity. Elena remained standing at attention. What kind of concerns, sir? Some of the younger officers have mentioned that your teaching methods are outdated, that you focus too heavily on personal interaction and cultural immersion, instead of helping them master the advanced systems they'll actually use in the field. Translation: she was teaching them to think for themselves instead of trusting blindly in technology. Sir, I believe a comprehensive understanding of both modern and traditional diplomatic methods. Major, Harrison interrupted, the military has evolved. We don't negotiate by instinct and cultural immersion anymore. These officers need to learn systems integration, computer-assisted cultural analysis, AI-coordinated negotiation strategies. What they don't need is someone filling their heads with ghost stories about the old days. Ghost stories. Her 3 dead teammates had become ghost stories. I understand, sir. I'll adjust my curriculum accordingly. Wallace nodded, seemingly satisfied. Good. Now, about tomorrow's mission. I want you to understand that your exclusion isn't personal. It's simply that we need officers who are current on operational procedures and familiar with modern diplomatic systems. Of course, sir. But as she turned to leave, Wallace added something that stopped her cold. Besides, this is exactly the kind of mission that separates the weak from the chaff. These young officers need to prove themselves under pressure. Better they learn to handle adversity now than in a real conflict. Learn to handle adversity with the lives of a trapped diplomatic team hanging in the balance. Walking back across the base under a sky full of stars, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in 4 years, the familiar knot of anticipation in her stomach that came before a mission. The same feeling she'd had the night before Olive Branch, when she'd known something was wrong but hadn't been able to convince anyone to listen. History, it seemed, was about to repeat itself. The mission briefing began at 0500 hours, with the kind of military precision that masked underlying chaos. Elena sat in the back row of the briefing room, officially there as an observer, but really present because Captain Chen had requested her attendance, quote, for educational purposes. General Wallace stood at the front of the room beside a large tactical display showing Corinth Valley in brutal detail. The terrain looked like something carved by an angry god. Jagged peaks, narrow valleys, and enough cultural complexity to swallow diplomatic teams whole.
Diplomatic Team Alpha 3 was conducting negotiations with regional leaders when they went dark, Wallace began. Satellite imagery suggests they're being held approximately 40 kilometers into the valley system here. He pointed to a red dot surrounded by hostile indicators. Lieutenant Mitchell raised his hand. Sir, what's the current faction presence in the target zone? Intel suggests moderate resistance, but the primary challenge will be cultural navigation. The valley creates unique tribal boundaries that can interfere with standard negotiation protocols. Elena's jaw tightened. Interfere was putting it mildly. The valley was a natural cultural maze that could turn the most sophisticated diplomatic tools into expensive paperweights. She'd tried to explain this to Wallace privately the night before, but he dismissed her concerns as outdated pessimism. Mission timeline is critical, Wallace continued. Negotiations window closes at 1,400 hours. After that, we're looking at 3 days of increased militia activity. If we don't extract the team today, they're on their own until conditions improve. 3 days in hostile territory with limited supplies and unknown injuries. Elena had seen what 3 days could do to stranded diplomats. The lucky ones didn't survive to be rescued. Approach path has been optimized for speed and efficiency, Colonel Walsh announced, activating a holographic route display. The projected path cut straight through Sector 4, just as Elena had feared. Direct approach through the valley mouth, following the main settlements to the extraction point. The route looked perfect on paper. Clean, direct, efficient. It was also exactly the kind of path that tribal conflicts love to turn into death traps. Elena cleared her throat. Excuse me, sir. I've reviewed the cultural data for Sector 4, and there's a significant tribal leadership dispute. Major Reyes, Wallace interrupted, without looking in her direction. Your concerns have been noted and evaluated. Our cultural analysis team has determined that current diplomatic systems are more than capable of handling any tribal sensitivities we might encounter. Murmurs of agreement from the volunteer officers. To them, she was the paranoid old-timer who saw disasters lurking behind every cultural difference. Sir, with respect, the tribal dynamics in that system are similar to conditions that can cause complete negotiation breakdown. I've experienced Major. Wallace's voice carried the kind of authority that ended discussions. These officers are using state-of-the-art diplomatic tools with triple redundant cultural analysis systems. Your experiences with older methods aren't relevant to current operational capabilities. The room fell silent, except for the hum of electronic displays. 8 young officers sat at attention, absolute confidence radiating from their posture. They believed in their training, their technology, their invincibility. Elena had believed in those same things once. Very well, sir, she said quietly, settling back into her chair. The technical briefing continued with discussions of approach vectors, communication protocols, and extraction procedures. Everything was planned to the minute, coordinated with surgical precision, backed up by the most advanced technology the military could provide. It was a perfect plan that would work flawlessly, right up until it didn't. After the briefing, Elena approached Lieutenant Mitchell near the preparation rooms. The young officer was reviewing mission parameters on his tablet, stylus dancing across the screen as he made notes. Lieutenant, could I have a word? Mitchell looked up, barely concealing his impatience. What can I do for you, Major? I've conducted missions in similar cultural terrain. The tribal conditions in Corinth Valley can be unpredictable. If your translation systems fail, if cultural analysis goes down, do you know how to read honor gestures and kinship signals? Mitchell's expression shifted from impatience to something approaching condescension. Major, respectfully, when would that ever be necessary? Our systems have backup systems for the backup systems. Complete cultural analysis failure just doesn't happen anymore. It happened to me. That was different. Older systems. Outdated methods. The Strategic Operations Division is remarkable, Elena interrupted, but they're still systems, and systems can fail when you need them most. Mitchell closed his tablet with a snap. Major, I appreciate your concern, but we've trained extensively for this type of mission. We know our capabilities better than anyone. The dismissal stung, but it was the absolute certainty in his voice that worried her most. She'd heard that same tone before Operation Olive Branch, from officers who believed so completely in their technology that they'd forgotten to prepare for the moment when technology wasn't enough. 30 minutes before departure, Elena found herself standing on the observation deck overlooking the landing pad. 8 tactical transport helicopters sat in perfect formation, their sleek profiles gleaming in the morning sun. Ground crews moved with practiced efficiency, conducting final pre-flight checks on aircraft that represented the pinnacle of military aviation technology. Her old weathered desk sat alone in Building 7, unofficial and unnoticed. Second thoughts about retirement, Captain? Chen approached from behind, carrying 2 cups of coffee that steamed in the cold morning air. I'm not retired, Elena replied, accepting the offered cup gratefully. Just reassigned. Chen nodded toward the landing pad. They're good officers. Young, confident, well-trained. Yes, they are. But Elena was quiet for a long moment, watching the ground crews complete their final checks. Confidence can be a liability when you're facing something you've never encountered before. These officers have never had their intelligence systems fail completely. They've never had to choose between following orders and keeping their people alive. They've never... She stopped herself, never had to walk back alone. The question hung in the air between them. Chen had read her complete service record, which meant she knew exactly what had happened during Operation Olive Branch. She knew about the 3 officers who hadn't come home, about the impossible choices that had haunted Elena for 4 years. I keep thinking about the tribal patterns, Elena said finally. The leadership structures, the honor codes. It's too similar to Olive Branch. Yes. They stood in silence, watching the final preparations. At exactly 0800 hours, the tactical helicopters began their engine startup sequence. The sound was magnificent. 8 perfectly tuned aircraft preparing to demonstrate American military superiority. Major Reyes, report to General Wallace's office immediately. The announcement crackled over the base communication system with unusual urgency. Elena exchanged a glance with Chen, both women recognizing the tone that meant something significant had changed. Wallace's office was crowded when she arrived. The general sat behind his desk with his usual composed expression, but Colonel Walsh stood beside him looking distinctly uncomfortable. Most unusually, Brigadier General Patricia Stone was present, her star gleaming on her uniform collar. Major Reyes, General Stone said, without preamble. We've received updated intelligence regarding the extraction mission. The situation is more complex than initially reported. Elena remained at attention, waiting for details. Diplomatic Team Alpha 3 wasn't just conducting negotiations, Walsh continued. They were investigating reports of advanced psychological warfare techniques in the Valley systems, specifically designed to interfere with modern diplomatic and cultural analysis systems. The knot in Elena's stomach tightened. What kind of interference, sir? Disinformation campaigns, deliberate cultural misdirection, possibly even targeted psychological manipulation, General Stone replied. The kind of techniques that could turn our most advanced diplomatic tools into expensive liabilities. Wallace shifted uncomfortably in his chair. General, surely our redundant systems. Colonel? Stone interrupted. 3 hours ago, a specialized intelligence officer, equipped with the same cultural analysis systems as our Strategic Operations Division, was sent into Corinth Valley. We lost contact immediately. When he managed to extract himself, his report indicated that every cultural parameter had been deliberately manipulated to create catastrophic misunderstandings. Silence filled the room like smoke from a crash site. Major Reyes, General Stone continued, your service record indicates extensive experience with traditional diplomatic methods and emergency cultural navigation. Have you ever successfully completed a negotiation mission with complete intelligence failure? Yes, ma'am. Operation Olive Branch 2018. Stone nodded. I've read the classified report. You negotiated peace with the Terek faction using cultural immersion and personal diplomacy after your entire team was either killed or disabled by intelligence failures? Yes, ma'am. The mission is a go in 20 minutes, Stone said, but I'm making one change to the roster. Major Reyes, you're taking Lieutenant Rivera's position as backup diplomatic lead. The room erupted in controlled chaos.
Wallace leaned forward in his chair, his composed expression finally cracking. General, with respect, Major Reyes hasn't conducted operational missions in 4 years. Her methodologies are a decade behind current protocol. This could compromise. Colonel, Stone's voice cut like a blade. We have a team of American diplomats trapped in hostile territory, facing enemies equipped with techniques specifically designed to neutralize our advantages. I want an officer who can bring them home when everything else fails. She turned to Elena. Major, you have 15 minutes to prepare. Take whatever equipment you think you'll need. As the general left, Wallace stood slowly behind his desk. His face was flushed with barely controlled anger. Major, let me be clear about something. You are backup diplomatic lead only. Lieutenant Mitchell maintains operational command. Your job is to follow orders and provide support if needed. Nothing more. Understood? Yes, sir. But as Elena hurried toward Building 7, she knew that orders and reality had a way of diverging when diplomatic missions started falling apart. Her old journal was already being prepared by Master Sergeant Torres, who had somehow anticipated this moment. The weathered notebook looked ancient compared to the sleek digital tablets and AI interface modules, but every page had been meticulously preserved and updated within the constraints of paper and ink. "Thought you might need this today," Torres said, handing her the small wooden box that contained her handwritten journal. "I took the liberty of updating your cultural references and checking the tribal leadership changes. Everything's annotated and ready." Elena strapped on her field gear, muscle memory guiding her through the preparation sequence. Around her, the traditional diplomatic tools hummed with reliable simplicity. No holographic cultural overlays, no AI-generated negotiation scripts, no algorithms to make decisions for her. Just an officer, her training, and a kind of hard-earned experience that couldn't be programmed or simulated. On the radio, she could hear the strategic operations officers conducting their final communications checks, their voices carrying the confidence of youth and the certainty of superior technology. "Fort Concordia Control, this is Alpha Leader requesting permission for deployment. Alpha Leader, you are cleared for departure. Cultural conditions optimal, tribal engagement unlimited." Optimal conditions? Elena glanced at her handwritten notes on tribal dynamics and frowned. The patterns indicated faster deterioration than the official report suggested. "Fort Concordia Control, this is Backup Leader requesting updated cultural analysis for Sector 4. Backup Leader, conditions remain within acceptable parameters. Maintain formation and follow Alpha Leader navigation. Acceptable parameters?" Elena opened her wooden box and pulled out the faded journal, comparing her handwritten notes to the official cultural brief displayed on her basic tablet. The computer wanted to take them straight through the heart of a tribal leadership dispute. Her journal suggested a longer, more complex route that would add 20 minutes to the journey but avoid the worst cultural misunderstandings. "All units prepare for deployment." Lieutenant Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio with absolute authority. Elena took a deep breath as the helicopter rotors spun up. Her transport was older and more basic than the rest of the formation, but it carried something the other aircraft lacked. A diplomat who knew what it felt like when everything went wrong at once. As the mountains of Corinth Valley rose ahead of them like the teeth of some enormous predator, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was flying into history, the same history that had killed 3 of her friends and nearly killed her. But this time, she was ready for it. 23 minutes into the flight, reality began to unravel. "Alpha Leader, I'm showing some discrepancies in my cultural analysis display." Lieutenant Martinez's voice crackled over the radio, with the first hint of uncertainty. Elena checked her position against the handwritten journal, then glanced at her paper map. They were approaching the outer edge of Sector 4, exactly where her calculations had predicted the cultural interference would begin. Her helicopter's older systems were largely manual, immune to the psychological warfare capabilities that turned modern diplomatic tools into expensive paperweights. "Alpha 2 confirmed discrepancies," Lieutenant Mitchell responded, his voice still carrying command authority but lacking its earlier absolute confidence. "Interim signal loss on cultural database. Some static on translation channels," came the reply. Elena keyed her radio. "Alpha Leader, this is Backup Leader. Recommend immediate course correction to bearing 270 to avoid the worst interference zone." "Negative, Backup Leader. Mission parameters require direct approach through current heading. Our systems are designed to handle minor cultural interference." Minor interference? Elena watched the helicopters around her as they flew deeper into the cultural chaos surrounding Corinth Valley. The tribal dispute she tried to warn them about was intensifying exactly as her experience had predicted. "Alpha Leader, I'm losing cultural database lock," another voice reported. "Alpha 4, same here. Translation computer is cycling through startup sequences. All units maintain visual formation," Mitchell ordered. "We'll navigate by landmark until we clear the interference zone." Visual formation in terrain where villages disappeared into mountain shadows and tribal boundaries looked identical from altitude. Elena pulled out her binoculars and studied the approaching valley system, comparing what she saw to the detailed cultural features marked in her handwritten journal. "Alpha Leader, I've operated in this terrain before. The valley system creates natural cultural dead zones that can persist for miles. Recommend we circle around to approach from Backup Leader, maintain radio silence unless emergency conditions exist." Mitchell's dismissal stung, but Elena bit back her response. She'd learned during Operation Olive Branch that pride was a luxury that got people killed. Her job wasn't to be right, it was to bring everyone home alive. The first officer went down at 0847 hours. Mayday, Mayday, this is Alpha 5. Complete system failure. Cultural interfaces are dark. I'm operating blind. Lieutenant Rodriguez's voice carried the sharp edge of panic that came when technology failed at the worst possible moment. Alpha 5, can you maintain visual reference? Mitchell's command authority was beginning to crack. Negative, Alpha Leader. I'm in cloud cover. No visual on terrain or formation. My cultural database is corrupted. Translation system is showing impossible readings. Elena keyed her radio immediately. Alpha 5, this is backup leader. I have you on visual. Come to heading 310. Decrease altitude to 7,000 feet. You'll break cloud cover in approximately 90 seconds. Backup leader negative. Alpha 5, maintain current heading, and the transmission ended in a burst of static. On her radio display, Alpha 5's signal disappeared completely. Alpha Leader, Alpha 5 is off the grid, came a shaky voice from Alpha 6. All units maintain formation and continue to extraction point, Mitchell ordered, but the confidence was gone from his voice, replaced by the kind of forced calm that meant someone was fighting panic. Elena checked her position against the journal again. They were flying directly into the heart of the cultural storm, exactly where her handwritten notes had indicated they should never go. Her helicopter's manual systems continued to function normally, but the radio chatter from the strategic operations teams indicated their advanced electronics were failing systematically. Alpha Leader, I'm showing multiple system warnings, reported Alpha 3. Same here. Translation computer just crashed completely. My cultural analysis is cycling through error messages. One by one, the most advanced diplomatic tools in the American military were being reduced to little more than expensive paperweights by a psychological phenomenon that intelligence textbooks said shouldn't exist. All units, this is Alpha Leader. We're aborting the mission and returning to base immediately. Alpha Leader, what about the extraction team? This came from Alpha 7, Lieutenant Parker, who had apparently maintained some communication capability. We can't help them if we can't navigate. All units come to heading 180 and climb to 15,000 feet. But as the formation attempted to execute the abort maneuver, the cultural interference intensified. Aircraft that had been flying in perfect formation suddenly found themselves scattered across dozens of miles of hostile airspace, their officers struggling with systems that provided contradictory information or no information at all. Alpha Leader, I can't find the formation. Where is everyone? Alpha 6, I'm showing you 15 miles off course, but that can't be right. This is Alpha 8. My translation system is reading complete hostility, but I took off with friendly indications 30 minutes ago. The radio dissolved into a chaos of panicked voices and conflicting reports. Sophisticated systems that had performed flawlessly in simulation were failing catastrophically in real-world conditions their designers had never anticipated. Elena flew steady and straight, using her compass, map, and the cultural features marked in her faded journal to maintain course toward the extraction point. Her helicopter wasn't the fastest or most advanced in the formation, but it was the only one still flying with reliable navigation. All units, this is backup leader, she transmitted calmly. I have visual on the extraction zone. The diplomatic team is alive and signaling from coordinates marked on my display. Static answered her. All units, please respond. This is backup leader. More static, punctuated by occasional fragments of panicked transmissions. Completely lost. Systems are showing. Can't identify. Elena was alone again, just like Operation Olive Branch. 8 officers with superior technology had been defeated by the same cultural phenomena that had claimed 3 of her teammates 4 years earlier. The difference was that this time she was prepared. Banking left toward the extraction coordinates, Elena spotted movement below. The diplomatic team was alive and attempting to signal with flares and colored panels, but the landing zone was worse than anything described in the mission briefing. Hostile militia patrols, unstable terrain, and barely enough clear space for an aircraft half the size of her helicopter. ALPHA-3, this is backup leader. I have visual on your position. Prepare for immediate extraction. Her radio crackled with a weak response. Backup leader, team leader here, 3 injured, under sporadic fire, can't hold position much longer. Elena circled the landing zone, studying the approach vectors with a kind of tactical analysis that came from years of impossible extractions. The cultural patterns were treacherous, tribal allegiances shifting through the valley in unpredictable waves that could slam a diplomatic mission into failure without warning. But she'd negotiated in worse conditions during Olive Branch, when desperation had been the only cultural aid that mattered. ALPHA3, I'm coming in. Mark your position with smoke if you have it. The approach required everything she'd learned about operating in conditions that shouldn't be survivable. No computer assistance, no automated cultural systems, just human instinct, and the kind of experience that came from surviving what others didn't. Her helicopter dropped toward the valley floor like a controlled crash, wind shear threatening to tear the aircraft apart, while Elena fought to maintain approach speed. At 50 feet above the ground, enemy fire erupted from concealed positions in the valley walls, muzzle flashes that lit up the shadows like deadly fireflies. Bullets punched through her helicopter's panels, sending hydraulic fluid streaming behind the aircraft in thin trails of silver. Warning lights blazed across her instrument panel like a Christmas tree, but the engine continued to run strong, and the controls responded to her touch. 30 seconds! She shouted into her radio as the aircraft settled toward the improvised landing zone. The helicopter hit the ground hard, bouncing twice before settling on terrain that looked like the surface of an alien planet. Before the engines had fully spooled down, Elena was out of the cockpit and running toward the diplomatic team's position. 6 officers in various states of injury and exhaustion were taking cover behind a cluster of boulders. Their team leader, a grizzled captain with blood seeping through a field dressing on his arm, looked at her with the kind of amazement usually reserved for miracles. "You're the officer from the radio?" "That's right, Captain. Let's get you people home." Loading the wounded officers into her cargo bay required every bit of space available in the aging helicopter. The diplomatic team had been carrying sensitive intelligence that couldn't be left behind, adding weight that pushed her helicopter beyond its recommended operational limits. "Ma'am," the captain said as they prepared for takeoff, "we heard the other aircraft go down. Are you sure this old bird can get us out of here?" Elena looked at her battered helicopter, wings punctured by enemy fire, hydraulic fluid leaking from multiple hits, warning lights indicating system failures throughout the aircraft. By any reasonable standard, attempting takeoff was suicide. "Captain," she replied, "this old bird has gotten me out of worse situations than this." The takeoff was a controlled disaster. Overloaded and damaged, the helicopter struggled to achieve lift in the thin mountain air, while enemy fire continued to rake the valley floor. Elena pushed the throttles beyond their red line limits, coaxing every ounce of performance from an aircraft that should have been in a museum. But as they climbed away from the extraction zone, she heard something that made every risk worthwhile: the sound of wounded officers laughing with relief, knowing they were going home. The flight back to Fort Concordia was a masterclass in flying damaged aircraft through impossible conditions. With multiple system failures and limited fuel, Elena had to navigate by dead reckoning while avoiding the cultural interference zones that had claimed the rest of her team. Her handwritten journal proved invaluable, showing the safe corridors through the mountains that her instruments couldn't detect. Every landmark was exactly where her faded ink had marked it. Every tribal boundary behaved according to the notes she'd scribbled in the margins during her first contact with this terrain. "Fort Concordia Control, this is backup leader requesting immediate medical assistance. 7 souls on board, 3 requiring urgent care." The response came immediately, filled with barely controlled emotion. "Backup leader, confirm your position. We show no other aircraft from your mission returning." "Fort Concordia Control, I'm 15 miles out on final approach. The extraction was successful, but I need emergency vehicles standing by." As her helicopter limped toward the landing pad, Elena could see medical vehicles and ambulances positioning themselves for her arrival. The entire base seemed to be watching as the only aircraft to return from the mission approached through smoke and damaged systems. The landing was harder than she would have preferred, but her aircraft held together long enough to get everyone home alive. As the wounded officers were transferred to waiting medical teams, Elena remained in her cockpit for a moment, hands shaking slightly from adrenaline and exhaustion. She'd done it again, brought everyone home when technology failed and superior equipment became worthless metal. But this time the victory felt different. This time, people had seen what happened when experience trumped innovation. when the old ways proved to be the only ways that actually worked. General Wallace arrived at her aircraft within minutes, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Behind him came General Stone, whose expression was entirely unreadable. "Major Reyes," Wallace began, "I need a full debrief on what happened out there." "The cultural interference was more severe than anticipated," Elena replied, climbing down from her cockpit. "The strategic operations team's electronic systems were overwhelmed, but traditional methods remained functional." General Stone stepped forward. "Major, are you saying that our most advanced diplomatic tools were defeated by tribal psychology?" "No, ma'am. They were defeated by over-reliance on technology that wasn't designed to operate in those specific cultural conditions. The systems themselves are excellent tools, but their operators weren't prepared for complete instrumentation failure." The general nodded slowly. "And you were prepared?" Elena pulled out her wooden box, opening it to reveal the handwritten journal that had guided her through impossible terrain twice in 4 years. The ink was more faded now, stained with blood from today's mission, but every line remained accurate. "Yes, ma'am. I was prepared." The debriefing room fell silent as Elena finished her detailed account of the mission. General Stone sat at the head of the conference table, surrounded by colonels, intelligence officers, and technical analysts who had spent the past 4 hours trying to understand how 8 advanced teams had been lost, while 1 obsolete helicopter had completed the mission successfully. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Major," General Stone said, reviewing her notes. "The strategic operations teams experienced complete navigational failure due to cultural interference that your approach was able to withstand?" "Not withstand, ma'am. Work around. My older methods are largely traditional and analog, which made them less susceptible to psychological warfare measures. But the primary factor was cultural methodology." General Wallace shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Major, are you suggesting that our tactical planning was inadequate?" Elena pulled out her wooden box and spread the handwritten journal on the conference table. To the assembled officers, it looked like something from a museum. Faded ink, worn edges, actual bloodstains embedded in the paper from Operation Olive Branch. "Sir, this journal shows cultural features and tribal conditions that don't appear in digital databases. Honor codes that change seasonally. Leadership structures that shift based on local events. Tribal alliances that can turn predictable diplomatic paths into death traps." Captain Chen, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the debriefing, leaned forward. "Major, how did you acquire this level of detailed cultural knowledge?" Quote, the question hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Elena traced one of the tribal boundaries with her finger, remembering the desperate negotiation that had brought her home from Operation Olive Branch. "Experience, Captain. 4 years ago, I operated in the same region when my team was hit by similar cultural interference. 3 officers died, but I managed to negotiate peace using traditional methods when all electronic systems failed." "And you documented these cultural pathways?" "I documented everything. Every tribal leader, every honor code, every cultural anomaly I encountered. I knew that someday someone else might need this information." General Stone studied the journal intently. "Major, this level of detail. This isn't standard military ethnography. This looks like the work of someone who expected to operate in this terrain again." "Yes, ma'am." Lieutenant Colonel Walsh, who had been silent throughout most of the debriefing, finally spoke. "Major Reyes, are you saying that you've been maintaining this intelligence database on your own initiative for 4 years? While assigned to instructor duty?" "Yes, sir." The room fell quiet as the implications sank in. For 4 years, while the base's leadership had dismissed her as an outdated relic, Elena had been quietly preparing for exactly the kind of mission that had just claimed 8 teams. General Wallace interjected, "I think we need to focus on the immediate tactical situation. We have 8 missing officers and—" "Colonel," General Stone interrupted, "we have 8 officers missing because our tactical planning failed to account for conditions that Major Reyes predicted and prepared for. I want to understand how that happened." Captain Chen opened a thick folder filled with cultural analysis data. "Ma'am, I've been reviewing the cultural assessment that supported the original mission planning. The tribal interference levels we encountered today were 3 times higher than our computer models predicted. But Major Reyes's analysis was accurate. Her handwritten notes show cultural patterns that match exactly what we experienced in the field. She predicted the interference zones. the intensity levels, even the specific approaches where systems would fail. General Wallace's face was flushed with barely controlled anger. With respect, General, we can't base military planning on handwritten notes and anecdotal experience. We have sophisticated computer models, satellite data, real-time intelligence feeds, all of which failed catastrophically today, General Stone replied coldly, while Major Reyes's, quote, anecdotal experience enabled her to complete the mission successfully. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elena remained silent, letting the facts speak for themselves. She'd learned during Operation Olive Branch that defending yourself too vigorously often made you look guilty of the accusations being made. Major, General Stone continued, I want you to walk me through your decision-making process during the mission. When did you realize the other aircraft were in trouble? Approximately 23 minutes into the flight, when we entered the outer edge of the cultural interference zone, the Strategic Operations Team's systems began failing in exactly the pattern I had experienced during Olive Branch. And your response? I recommended immediate course correction to avoid the worst interference, but operational command was maintained by Lieutenant Mitchell, as per mission parameters. General Wallace leaned forward aggressively. Major, are you criticizing Lieutenant Mitchell's command decisions? Elena met his gaze steadily. No, sir. Lieutenant Mitchell followed the mission plan exactly as briefed. The fault wasn't in the execution, it was in the planning assumptions. What do you mean? The mission plan assumed that modern diplomatic systems would be sufficient to handle any cultural conditions we might encounter. That assumption proved incorrect. Captain Chen consulted her notes. Major, during your pre-mission briefings, did you attempt to share your cultural knowledge with the other officers? Yes, Captain. I recommended alternative approach paths and suggested the officers prepare for traditional diplomacy in case of system failure. And the response? Elena glanced at General Wallace before answering. The recommendations were noted but not incorporated into the official mission plan. The officers were confident that their training and equipment would be sufficient. General Stone's expression was unreadable. Major, in your professional opinion, could today's losses have been prevented? Quote, the question hung in the air, like a loaded weapon. Elena knew that her answer would determine not just her own future, but potentially the careers of everyone in the room. Yes, ma'am. If the mission plan had incorporated alternative cultural methods and avoided the most severe interference zones, all teams could have reached the extraction point safely. Based on information that you possessed but was not included in the official briefing. Yes, ma'am. General Wallace stood abruptly. General, I object to this line of questioning. Major Reyes is essentially claiming that her personal theories should have overridden established military planning procedures. We can't run operations based on the hunches of individual officers. Colonel, General Stone replied, Major Reyes's hunches resulted in a successful extraction while our established procedures resulted in 8 lost teams. I'm beginning to think we need to reconsider which approach is more reliable. The meeting continued for another 2 hours, with technical experts analyzing every aspect of the mission failure, but the core issue remained simple. Experience had triumphed over technology, and the military's most sophisticated diplomatic tools had been defeated by conditions that one officer with a handwritten journal had navigated successfully. As the debriefing finally concluded, General Stone approached Elena privately. Major, I'm recommending you for immediate restoration to active operational status. We need officers who can operate when everything else fails. Thank you, ma'am, but I need to ask you something directly. Why didn't you fight harder to get your intelligence included in the mission planning? Elena was quiet for a moment, considering her answer. General, I've learned that sometimes people need to see failure before they're willing to consider alternatives. But you knew you weren't wrong. Yes, ma'am, I knew. That evening, word spread quickly through Fort Concordia about the day's events. The impossible had happened. The forgotten instructor had succeeded where the elite teams had failed. Officers who had dismissed her as outdated were now quietly asking technical questions about traditional diplomacy and cultural immersion. Elena found herself in Building 7, performing post-mission organization of her battered journal. The notebook looked like it had been through a war, with bullet holes, bloodstains, and damage that would require weeks to repair properly. But it had brought everyone home. Master Sergeant Torres approached with a cup of coffee and a satisfied expression. Heard you had an interesting day, Major. You could say that. Also heard that some people are finally starting to ask the right questions about why our most advanced systems couldn't handle what your old methods took in stride. Elena accepted the coffee gratefully. Technology is only as good as the people who understand its limitations, Sergeant. Today we learned that our limitations were more severe than anyone wanted to admit. As she worked on her journal, Elena reflected on the day's events. 8 officers were missing, possibly dead, because the military had chosen to trust computers over experience, but 6 diplomats were alive, because one officer had remembered that the old ways sometimes worked when the new ways failed. The victory felt hollow, but it was a victory nonetheless. And for the first time in 4 years, people were finally ready to listen to what she had been trying to tell them. The emergency meeting convened at 0600 hours sharp, 12 hours after Elena's successful return from Corinth Valley. General Stone had flown in from Pentagon Command overnight, bringing with her a team of investigators whose presence suggested that today's events would have consequences far beyond Fort Concordia. Elena sat in the conference room's front row, still wearing her field gear from the previous day's mission. Around her, the atmosphere was tense, with the kind of energy that preceded major changes in military policy. General Wallace sat across the table, his face a mask of professional composure that couldn't quite hide his underlying anxiety. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Stone began, "we're here to conduct a comprehensive review of yesterday's mission failure and to address systemic issues in our diplomatic planning procedures." The phrase "systemic issues" carried weight in military circles. It meant that someone's career was about to end, and fingers were pointing in multiple directions. "Major Reyes," Stone continued, "please provide the investigation team with a complete tactical analysis of the cultural interference patterns you encountered." Elena opened her wooden box and spread her handwritten journal on the conference table. To the assembled investigators, the faded document looked like an artifact from a bygone era, which in many ways it was. "The interference began at approximately these coordinates," she said, pointing to a section marked with careful notations. "Intensity increased exponentially as we approached the Valley system, reaching levels that overwhelmed modern cultural computers but were consistent with patterns I documented during Operation Olive Branch." Brigadier General Marcus Thompson, one of Stone's investigators, leaned forward to examine the journal more closely. "Major, this level of detail. When did you create this documentation?" "The original mapping was completed in 2018, sir. I've been updating it quarterly based on seasonal leadership changes and tribal activity data." "You've been maintaining independent intelligence files for 4 years." "Yes, sir." General Wallace cleared his throat. "General Thompson, I should point out that Major Reyes's personal research project was conducted without official approval or oversight. These documents haven't been validated by our intelligence analysts." The implication was clear. Elena had been operating outside established protocols, conducting unauthorized intelligence gathering that could potentially compromise operational security. "Colonel," General Stone replied icily, "Major Reyes's unauthorized intelligence proved more accurate than our official analysis. Perhaps we should be asking why our established systems failed so completely." Captain Chen, who had been reviewing technical data at the back of the room, approached with a thick folder. "General, I've completed a comparative analysis of Major Reyes's cultural documentation versus our official intelligence databases. Your findings? The data is not only accurate, it's more comprehensive than anything in our current systems." She identified cultural anomalies, seasonal leadership patterns, and tribal features that don't appear in any official military ethnography. General Wallace's expression darkened. "Captain, are you suggesting that Major Reyes's personal files are more reliable than Pentagon-approved intelligence databases?" "I'm suggesting that her files contain critical information that doesn't exist anywhere else in our intelligence network." The room fell silent as the implications settled. For 4 years, while the military had invested billions in sophisticated intelligence gathering systems, one dismissed officer had been quietly assembling more accurate tactical information using nothing but personal observation and careful documentation. "Major Reyes," General Thompson said, "I need to understand your methodology. How did you acquire intelligence data that our official systems missed?" Elena chose her words carefully. "Sir, I spent extensive time studying this terrain after Operation Olive Branch because I knew the military would return here eventually. I used personal leave time to conduct observational visits, correlated cultural data with tribal readings, and documented patterns that weren't captured in standard reconnaissance reports." Personal leave time? Yes, sir. I used my own resources and time to conduct intelligence gathering that I believed would be valuable for future operations. The investigators exchanged glances. What Elena was describing went far beyond normal officer dedication. It bordered on obsession, with a level of detail that professional intelligence analysts had missed. Major, General Wallace interjected, did you attempt to share this intelligence with appropriate command authorities? The question was a trap, and everyone in the room knew it. If Elena said yes, Wallace could argue that proper channels had been followed, and the intelligence had been rejected for valid reasons. If she said no, he could claim she had been deliberately withholding critical information. Sir, I made several attempts to brief command staff on cultural conditions in the Corinth Valley region. These briefings were noted but not incorporated into operational planning. Why not? Elena glanced around the room, seeing career military officers who had built their reputations on following established procedures and trusting institutional systems. Because my recommendations were based on personal experience rather than official intelligence sources. Command preferred to rely on computer models and satellite data. General Stone leaned forward. Major, in your opinion, why did our official intelligence fail to identify the cultural conditions that brought down 8 teams? Another loaded question. Elena's answer would either validate the military's intelligence gathering methods or expose fundamental flaws in billion-dollar systems. Ma'am, artificial intelligence focuses on broad regional patterns using satellite data and computer modeling. These methods are excellent for strategic planning but can miss localized phenomena that require direct observation to detect, such as the cultural anomalies you encountered. Yes, ma'am. The interference patterns in Corinth Valley are caused by unique tribal formations interacting with local authority structures. This creates cultural dead zones that shift seasonally and can't be predicted by standard anthropological models. General Thompson consulted his notes. Major, you're describing conditions that would require years of direct observation to map accurately. How long have you been studying this region? 4 years, sir. And during this time you've been officially assigned to instructor duty? Yes, sir. General Wallace saw his opening. General, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. Major Reyes has been conducting unauthorized intelligence operations while assigned to non-operational duties. This raises serious questions about proper chain of command and operational security. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Wallace was suggesting that Elena had been operating as a rogue agent, conducting unauthorized reconnaissance that could potentially compromise military operations. Colonel, General Stone replied, Major Reyes's unauthorized operations consisted of using personal time to study terrain that subsequently proved critical to mission success. Are you seriously suggesting that was improper? I'm suggesting that we have established procedures for intelligence gathering and operational planning. When individual officers decide to operate outside these procedures, it creates risks that could compromise larger operations. Elena remained silent, letting Wallace dig his own grave. She'd learned during Operation Olive Branch that sometimes the best defense was allowing your opponents to reveal their priorities. Major Reyes, General Thompson said, did you ever consider submitting your intelligence findings through official channels? I made several attempts, sir. However, my reports were consistently rejected because they contradicted established intelligence assessments. Rejected by whom? Elena glanced at General Wallace. By base command, sir. The room fell silent except for the scratch of pens as investigators made notes. Wallace's face was flushed with barely controlled anger, but he couldn't deny the facts without lying to Pentagon investigators. Captain Chen approached with another folder. General, I've reviewed Major Reyes's attempted briefings over the past 4 years. She submitted 14 separate reports regarding cultural anomalies in the Corinth Valley region. All were rejected with notations that they contradicted official intelligence assessments. 14 reports? Yes, ma'am. Each one predicted the exact conditions that caused yesterday's mission failure. General Stone's expression was unreadable. Colonel Wallace, why were these reports rejected? Wallace shifted uncomfortably. General, we received numerous reports from various sources. We can't incorporate every individual officer's theories into operational planning without proper validation through official channels. Even when those theories prove accurate, General, we had no way of knowing they would prove accurate at the time. It was the wrong answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Wallace had essentially admitted that the military had chosen to ignore accurate intelligence because it came from the wrong source. "Major Reyes," General Stone said, "if you had been included in yesterday's mission planning, could the aircraft losses have been prevented?" "Yes, ma'am. The cultural interference zones I documented could have been avoided with alternative approach paths that would have added only 20 minutes to the mission timeline." 20 minutes? "Yes, ma'am." General Thompson leaned back in his chair. "So we lost 8 teams and officers to save 20 minutes of flight time?" The question echoed through the conference room like a gunshot. 8 families would be grieving because the military had chosen efficiency over experience, technology over wisdom. "Major," General Stone continued, "I want your professional assessment. How many of our current operational plans might be based on similar intelligence failures?" It was the question that would change everything. Elena knew that her answer would either validate decades of military planning or expose systematic flaws that could affect operations worldwide.
General, any operation that relies exclusively on satellite intelligence and computer modeling without incorporating direct observational data could face similar challenges. Modern systems are excellent for most conditions, but they have blind spots that can only be identified through field experience. Blind spots that could prove fatal? Yes, ma'am. The meeting continued for another 3 hours, with investigators probing every aspect of the intelligence failure that had cost 8 teams. But the fundamental issue was already clear. The military's most sophisticated systems had been defeated by conditions that one dismissed officer had predicted and prepared for. As the session concluded, General Wallace approached Elena with an expression that mixed anger and desperation. "Major, I hope you understand the implications of what you've done here today. You've essentially accused this entire command structure of incompetence." Elena met his gaze steadily. "No, sir. I've simply provided accurate information about operational conditions that proved critical to mission success. Information that you gathered through unauthorized means. Information that could have saved 8 officers if it had been incorporated into mission planning." Wallace's face flushed with anger. "Major, your career at this base is finished. I'll make sure you never fly operational missions again." It was a threat, pure and simple. But as Elena looked around the conference room at investigators who were documenting systematic intelligence failures, she realized that Wallace's threats might be empty. For the first time in 4 years, the truth was finally being heard by people who had the authority to act on it. The question was whether that truth had come too late to save the 8 officers who were still missing in Corinth Valley. The courtroom at Fort Concordia was packed beyond capacity. What had begun as a routine investigation into mission failures had evolved into a formal military tribunal that would determine the future of diplomatic planning procedures across the entire armed forces. Elena sat at the witness table, wearing her dress blues with the ribbons that told the story of her military career. Across the room, General Wallace was flanked by Pentagon lawyers whose presence suggested that this hearing would have implications far beyond one base commander's decisions. General Stone served as the presiding officer, supported by a panel of senior military officials who had flown in from Washington. The atmosphere was tense with the kind of energy that preceded major changes in military policy. "This tribunal is convened to investigate intelligence failures related to the Corinth Valley mission of December 15th, General Stone announced. "We will examine systematic issues in operational planning that resulted in the loss of 8 teams and officers." The phrase systematic issues carried weight that everyone in the room understood. Careers would end today, and institutional procedures would be questioned at the highest levels. "Major Reyes," the general continued, "please provide your complete testimony regarding the intelligence you attempted to share with Base Command over the past 4 years." Elena opened her wooden box and carefully removed the handwritten journal that had become the centerpiece of the investigation. The faded document looked impossibly fragile under the harsh courtroom lights, but its accuracy had been validated by Pentagon analysts who had spent weeks comparing her notations to satellite data. "General, beginning in 2018, I submitted quarterly reports documenting cultural anomalies in the Corinth Valley region. These reports predicted the exact interference patterns that caused the mission failure on December 15th. How many reports did you submit?" 17 reports over 4 years, ma'am. Each one was rejected by Base Command as inconsistent with official intelligence assessments. General Wallace's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman in navy dress whites, stood to object. General Major Reyes's so-called reports were unsupported personal theories that contradicted validated intelligence from multiple Pentagon sources. Commander Peterson, General Stone replied. Major Reyes's personal theories proved more accurate than our validated intelligence. Perhaps you could explain why Pentagon sources failed to identify conditions that one officer documented with handwritten notes? The question hung in the air like smoke from a crash site. Peterson had just been asked to defend the entire military intelligence establishment against the demonstrated accuracy of one officer's personal observations. General, military planning requires validated intelligence from official sources. We cannot base operational decisions on individual theories, regardless of their eventual accuracy. It was the wrong argument to make in a room where 8 empty chairs represented the cost of ignoring accurate intelligence. Commander, General Stone said coldly, are you suggesting that accuracy is less important than following proper bureaucratic procedures? Captain Chen approached the witness table with a thick folder. General, I've prepared a comparative analysis of Major Reyes's intelligence versus official Pentagon assessments for the Carinth Valley region. Your findings? Major Reyes's documentation is 97% accurate across all measurable parameters. Official intelligence assessments average 63% accuracy for the same region. The numbers echoed through the courtroom like artillery fire. The military's billion-dollar intelligence systems had been outperformed by one officer, with empathy and careful observation. Captain, General Wallace's attorney interjected, how can you validate intelligence that was gathered through unauthorized methods? Chen turned to face the defense table. Commander, I validated it by comparing Major Reyes's predictions to actual field conditions encountered during the December 15th mission. Her documentation predicted cultural interference levels within 5% of measured values. Official intelligence predictions were off by more than 300%. General Stone leaned forward. Major Reyes, walk the tribunal through your attempt to brief base command before the December 15th mission. Elena consulted her notes. General, I requested permission to brief the mission planners on cultural conditions that could affect diplomatic systems. Specifically, I wanted to recommend alternative approach paths that would avoid the most severe interference zones. And the response? General Wallace informed me that my concerns had been noted, but that the mission would proceed according to established tactical planning procedures. Despite your documented experience in similar terrain? Yes, ma'am. The prosecution called Master Sergeant Torres as their next witness. The grizzled operations chief approached this stand with the kind of weathered confidence that came from 30 years of keeping teams operational. Sergeant Torres, the prosecutor began, were you aware of Major Reyes's intelligence-gathering activities? Yes, sir. Major Reyes would spend her personal leave time conducting observational visits over the mountain regions. She'd return with detailed notes about tribal patterns, cultural readings, and terrain conditions. Did you consider this unusual? Torres smiled grimly. Sir, I considered it the sign of an officer who understood that technology fails when you need it most. Major Reyes was preparing for the missions everyone else hoped would never happen. Did Major Reyes ever discuss her findings with other personnel? She tried to, sir. She'd brief anyone who would listen about the conditions in those mountains. Most folks figured she was being overly cautious. General Wallace's attorney cross-examined aggressively. Sergeant, are you aware that Major Reyes's activities violated regulations regarding unauthorized intelligence gathering? Torres looked at her like she'd asked whether water was wet. Ma'am, Major Reyes used her personal time and her personal resources to study terrain that ended up saving American lives. If that's a violation, then I guess we need better regulations. The testimony continued for 3 days, with witness after witness confirming that Elena had repeatedly attempted to share intelligence that could have prevented the mission failure. Pentagon analysts testified that her handwritten journal contained information that didn't exist in any official database. Training instructors confirmed that she had been teaching traditional diplomatic techniques that other officers had dismissed as obsolete. The picture that emerged was devastating for base command. A veteran officer with critical intelligence had been systematically ignored because her methods didn't conform to institutional preferences. On the final day of the tribunal, General Wallace took the stand in his own defense. His testimony was professionally delivered, but couldn't escape the fundamental facts of the case. Colonel, the prosecutor asked, why did you reject Major Reyes's intelligence reports? Because they contradicted established assessments from Pentagon intelligence sources. Military planning requires validated information from official channels. Even when that validated information proved inaccurate? We had no way of knowing it would prove inaccurate at the time.
But Major Reyes's reports proved accurate. Wallace's composure finally cracked. Major Reyes's reports were based on personal theories and unvalidated observations. We cannot run military operations based on individual hunches. Individual hunches that saved 6 diplomats' lives. That's not the point. Then what is the point, Colonel? Wallace was quiet for a long moment, realizing that he'd been backed into a corner from which there was no escape. The point is maintaining proper chain of command and following established procedures. It was the answer that sealed his fate. In a room where 8 officers' deaths represented the cost of following established procedures, Wallace had just admitted that he valued bureaucratic compliance over operational effectiveness. General Stone's verdict was delivered with the kind of precision that ended careers and changed institutional policies. This tribunal finds that the intelligence failures of December 15th resulted from systematic rejection of accurate tactical information due to institutional bias against non-traditional intelligence sources. The general's gaze fixed on General Wallace. Colonel, your command decisions prioritized procedural compliance over operational effectiveness, resulting in preventable losses of personnel and equipment. You are hereby relieved of command and recommended for immediate retirement. Wallace's face went pale, but he remained at attention as his career dissolved around him. Major Reyes, Stone continued, this tribunal finds that your intelligence-gathering activities, while technically outside established procedures, demonstrated exceptional initiative and provided critical information that prevented greater losses. You are hereby reinstated to full operational status with immediate promotion to lieutenant colonel. The courtroom erupted in applause from officers and support personnel who had watched the proceedings. For 4 years they had seen competence dismissed and experience ignored. Today justice had finally been served. But Elena felt no satisfaction in Wallace's downfall. 8 officers were still missing, and no tribunal verdict could bring them home. As she left the courtroom, General Stone approached her privately. Lieutenant Colonel Reyes, I have an offer for you. Pentagon Command wants you to head a new intelligence assessment program, one that combines traditional methods with advanced technology. What would that involve, ma'am? Training officers to think for themselves instead of trusting blindly in technology. Teaching the kind of tactical awareness that saved 6 lives in Corinth Valley. Elena considered the offer. It would mean leaving Fort Concordia, abandoning the familiar routines of instructor duty, returning to the world of operational planning and strategic decision-making. Ma'am, I'd like to remain here at Fort Concordia. General Stone raised an eyebrow. Lieutenant Colonel, this is an opportunity to influence tactical planning at the highest levels. You could prevent intelligence failures like this from happening again. Elena looked through the courtroom windows at the training ground where young officers were conducting exercises. General, the best place to prevent future failures is right here, teaching the next generation of officers that technology is a tool, not a crutch. Stone nodded slowly. Very well, Lieutenant Colonel, but I want you to establish a new training program, one that incorporates the lessons learned from December 15th. Show these young officers what real tactical awareness looks like. As the general left, Elena remained alone in the empty courtroom, thinking about the 8 officers who hadn't come home. Their sacrifice had finally forced the military to confront uncomfortable truths about the limitations of technology and the value of experience. She opened her wooden box one last time, looking at the handwritten journal that had become evidence in a case that changed military policy. The faded ink and worn edges told the story of preparation, persistence, and the kind of hard-earned wisdom that couldn't be programmed into computers. Tomorrow she would begin training a new generation of officers. But tonight she would remember the ones who had been lost because no one wanted to listen to an old officer with a handwritten journal. 6 months after the tribunal, Lieutenant Colonel Elena Reyes stood before a packed auditorium at Fort Concordia, addressing the largest gathering of military officers and tactical planners in the facility's history. Word had spread throughout the armed forces about the Corinth Valley incident and its aftermath, drawing personnel from bases across the country who wanted to understand how one dismissed instructor had succeeded where the military's most advanced systems had failed. Ladies and gentlemen, Elena began, her voice carrying the authority that came from surviving what others hadn't. I want to tell you about the most important lesson I've learned in 20 years of military service. Human connection will save your life right up until the moment technology abandons you. The auditorium was silent except for the scratch of pens as officers took notes. Behind Elena, a large screen displayed her handwritten journal of Corinth Valley, alongside satellite imagery and computer-generated tactical displays. The contrast was striking: faded ink and careful handwriting versus high-resolution digital perfection. This journal, she continued, pointing to her weather documentation, contains information that doesn't exist in any Pentagon database. Not because our intelligence systems are inadequate, but because some knowledge can only be acquired through direct human experience. Lieutenant Mitchell, who had survived the Corinth Valley mission with minor injuries after his helicopter was recovered 4 days later, raised his hand. "Ma'am, how do we balance reliance on proven technology with the need for traditional skills?" It was the question that had driven 6 months of heated debate within military leadership. How could the world's most technologically advanced military incorporate lessons that seemed to contradict everything modern warfare represented? "Lieutenant, the goal isn't to choose between old methods and new technology. The goal is to understand that technology amplifies human capability. It doesn't replace human judgment." Elena activated a presentation that showed comparative analysis of the December 15th mission. "Your strategic operations teams are magnificent specialists with capabilities that my traditional methods can't match. But when cultural interference disabled your systems, you needed skills that weren't part of your standard training." Captain Rodriguez, recently promoted after his own harrowing experience in Corinth Valley, asked, "Ma'am, what specific skills should modern officers prioritize?" "Cultural immersion, traditional diplomacy, visual leadership identification, and most importantly, the ability to recognize when your systems are lying to you." Elena clicked to the next slide, showing cultural interference patterns. Technology fails predictably under certain conditions. If you understand those conditions, you can prepare alternatives. The presentation continued for 2 hours, covering everything from traditional negotiation techniques to decision-making under uncertainty. But the core message remained simple: preparation and experience trumped sophistication and confidence when everything went wrong simultaneously. After the formal presentation, Elena found herself surrounded by young officers, eager to learn skills their instructors had dismissed as obsolete. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, these same officers had considered her outdated and irrelevant. "Lieutenant Colonel," a young captain asked, "why didn't anyone teach us these techniques during officer training school?" Elena considered her answer carefully. "Because for the past decade, our technology has been so reliable that traditional skills seemed unnecessary. We forgot that the purpose of backup systems isn't to replace primary systems. It's to function when primary systems fail." Lieutenant Torres, Master Sergeant Torres's daughter, who had recently graduated from the academy, approached with a question that struck to the heart of the issue. "Ma'am, how do we know when to trust our instruments and when to trust our instincts?" "Experience," Elena replied. "And until you have enough experience to make that judgment, you prepare for both possibilities." The new training program that emerged from the Corinth Valley investigation was unlike anything in military history. The Reyes Protocol, as officers have begun calling it, combined cutting-edge technology with traditional negotiation skills, creating diplomats who could operate effectively when sophisticated systems failed. Every student learned to navigate by cultural landmarks and tribal recognition. Every training mission included scenarios where electronic systems were deliberately disabled. Most importantly, every officer learned to question their instruments when conditions suggested potential interference. The results were dramatic. Within 6 months, officers trained under the new protocol showed significantly improved performance in adverse conditions. More importantly, they developed a kind of tactical thinking that could adapt to unexpected situations. But the real test came when Lieutenant Rodriguez led a diplomatic mission into hostile territory, where enemy psychological operations had disabled cultural databases for an entire team. Using techniques learned from Elena's program, he successfully navigated 12 officers through cultural interference that would have been catastrophic 6 months earlier. All personnel returned safely. "Traditional diplomacy worked exactly as Lieutenant Colonel Reyes taught us," Rodriguez reported during his debrief. The success of the new training program attracted attention from the highest levels of military leadership. Pentagon officials who had initially resisted changes to established procedures were now demanding expansion of the program to bases worldwide. General Stone visited Fort Concordia to personally observe the training program that had emerged from the ashes of the December 15th disaster. She found Elena in Building 7, working alongside students to update handwritten journals that had become symbols of reliability and preparedness. "Lieutenant Colonel, I have to admit something," Stone said as they watched young officers practice traditional negotiation techniques. "When I first read your service record, I thought you were a relic from an earlier era of warfare." Elena smiled, her hands stained with ink from updating cultural annotations. "General, maybe I am a relic, but sometimes old methods work because they've been tested by people who couldn't afford for them to fail. The Pentagon wants to expand your training program to every base in the armed forces." "That's excellent news, ma'am." Stone studied the organized chaos of students learning to negotiate without computers. "Lieutenant Colonel, I need to ask you something directly. Do you believe we've become too dependent on technology?" Elena set down her pen and considered the question. "General, technology isn't the problem. Overconfidence in technology is the problem. When we start believing that our systems are infallible, we stop preparing for the moment when they fail. And they will fail. Everything fails eventually, ma'am. The question is whether we're ready when it happens." That evening, Elena sat at her desk reading letters from families of the 8 officers lost during the Corinth Valley mission. Some blamed her for not fighting harder to prevent the disaster. Others thanked her for ensuring that their sons' and daughters' deaths had led to changes that would protect future officers. The letters were difficult to read, but they reminded her why the new training program mattered. 8 families had paid the ultimate price for institutional overconfidence. Her job was to make sure their sacrifice led to meaningful change. Master Sergeant Torres approached with his usual cup of coffee and a satisfied expression. "Heard the Pentagon wants to name the new training program after you officially." "I'd prefer they name it after the 8 officers we lost," Elena replied. "Already suggested that. They're calling it the Olive Branch Protocol, in honor of Operation Olive Branch and the December 15th mission." Elena nodded approvingly. The name honored both her lost teammates from 2018 and the 8 officers from Corinth Valley. It was fitting that a program designed to prevent future losses would carry the names of those who had died when preparation and experience were dismissed as unnecessary. "Sergeant, do you think we've learned anything from this?" Torres laughed, but it was hollow. "Ma'am, the military has a short memory for uncomfortable lessons. But maybe this time enough people saw what happened when experience was ignored." As the months passed, the Olive Branch Protocol expanded beyond Fort Concordia to installations worldwide. Young officers who had grown up trusting technology learned to negotiate by tradition and cultural understanding. Tactical planners who had relied exclusively on computer models began incorporating observational intelligence from experienced officers. The changes weren't universal, and resistance remained strong among commanders who had built careers on technological superiority. But the success rates spoke for themselves. Officers trained under the new protocol performed significantly better in adverse conditions. More importantly, a generation of military leaders was learning that the most sophisticated instrument in any operation was the trained judgment of the officer leading it. 1 year after the Corinth Valley incident, Elena received a letter that changed everything. It was from Colonel Mitchell, now commanding a tactical division in the Middle East. "Lieutenant Colonel Reyes," the letter began. "I wanted you to know that your training saved my division last week. We encountered cultural interference that would have been catastrophic 6 months ago, but every officer knew how to navigate traditionally. All personnel returned safely. I realize now that dismissing your experience was the worst mistake of my military career. You weren't teaching outdated methods. You were teaching survival skills that our technology had made us forget we needed. The next time someone suggests that experience doesn't matter in modern warfare, I'll tell them about an officer who saved 6 lives with a handwritten journal and the wisdom to prepare for what everyone else thought was impossible." Elena folded the letter carefully and placed it in her wooden box alongside the faded journal that had started everything. The box was fuller now, containing letters from officers who had been saved by techniques learned at Fort Concordia, technical specifications for improved cultural systems that incorporated manual backup procedures, and commendations from Pentagon officials who had finally understood the value of combining technology with human experience. But the most important item in the box remained the original handwritten journal from Operation Olive Branch. The ink was more faded now, stained with blood from multiple missions, but every line remained accurate. As she prepared for another day of training young officers who would carry these lessons to bases around the world, Elena reflected on the price of wisdom. 3 officers had died in Operation Olive Branch because the military hadn't been prepared for conditions that technology couldn't handle. 8 more had been lost at Corinth Valley because institutional arrogance had dismissed the lessons learned from that earlier tragedy. But now hundreds of officers were learning skills that would keep them alive when everything else failed. They were learning that confidence was valuable, but preparation was essential. They were learning that the newest technology was worthless without the judgment to use it properly. Most importantly, they were learning that sometimes the old ways were the only ways that worked, not because they were better, but because they had been tested by people who couldn't afford for them to fail. Standing on the training ground at Fort Concordia, watching a new generation of officers practice negotiation techniques that might save their lives someday, Elena finally felt that the weight of Operation Olive Branch had been lifted from her shoulders. 11 officers had died because experience was dismissed as irrelevant, but their sacrifice had finally taught the military that the measure of an officer wasn't in the sophistication of their equipment or the perfection of their training scores. The measure of an officer was in their ability to bring everyone home alive when everything that could go wrong had gone wrong, and that was a lesson worth any price. 2 years after the Corinth Valley incident, Lieutenant Colonel Reyes found herself in a position she never expected, delivering the commencement address at the Officer Training School graduation ceremony. Standing before 500 fresh-faced graduates, she saw both the past and future of military leadership. "When I stood where you are now," she began, "I believed that technology would solve every problem I might face in the field. I was certain that with enough advanced systems, enough data, enough artificial intelligence, we could eliminate the fog of war entirely." Elena paused, letting her gaze sweep across the sea of expectant faces. "I was wrong. And that mistake cost lives." The auditorium was completely silent. In military circles, Elena's story had become legendary. The officer too soft for war who had brought peace when everyone else had failed. "Technology will fail you," she continued. "Not might fail you. Not could fail you. Will fail you. At the worst possible moment, when lives hang in the balance, your systems will go dark, your data will corrupt, your AI will make catastrophic recommendations based on flawed assumptions." Several of the senior officers seated behind Elena shifted uncomfortably. Despite the success of the Olive Branch Protocol, there remained resistance to her message in certain quarters. But here's what your instructors may not have emphasized enough. That moment of failure is not the end. It's the beginning. It's the moment when you discover what kind of officer you truly are. Elena stepped away from the podium, choosing to walk the edge of the stage, making eye contact with individual graduates. The most important quality you can develop isn't technical proficiency or tactical knowledge. It's adaptability, the ability to function effectively when everything you've been taught, everything you've planned for, everything you rely on, suddenly disappears. She pulled out her wooden box, now a famous artifact that had been replicated in training centers worldwide. This contains a handwritten journal that saved lives when billion-dollar systems failed. Not because paper is superior to technology, but because the human mind that created it understood something fundamental. Preparation trumps sophistication every time. Opening the box, Elena removed not her journal but something new, a small electronic tablet. This contains the complete Olive Branch Protocol. Every lesson, every technique, every hard-earned insight from officers who learned to operate when systems failed. It combines the best of traditional methods with cutting-edge technology. She held up the tablet. "For the first time, we're issuing these to every graduating officer, not to replace your advanced systems, but to serve as a constant reminder that you are the ultimate backup system. When everything else fails, you remain." The cadets exchanged glances, sensing they were witnessing a pivotal moment in military education. "Some will tell you that this emphasis on traditional methods represents a step backward," Elena continued. "They're wrong. True progress isn't blindly embracing the new while discarding the old. It's taking the best of both and creating something stronger than either could be alone." Elena returned to the podium, her voice growing more passionate. "The enemy you face, whether in conventional warfare or asymmetric conflict, is counting on your over-reliance on technology. They're developing increasingly sophisticated methods to blind your sensors, corrupt your data, and isolate you from command. When that happens, not if, when, Your training in traditional methods may be the only thing standing between mission failure and success. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. What had begun as a standard commencement address had become something far more powerful, a call to a new kind of military thinking. I stand before you today not as someone who rejected technology, but as someone who discovered its limitations in the hardest possible way. The Olive Branch Protocol doesn't teach you to abandon your advanced systems. It teaches you to use them more effectively by understanding when not to rely on them. Elena gestured to a group of officers seated in the front row. These officers survived the Corinth Valley incident. They were the elite of the Strategic Operations Division, trained on the most advanced diplomatic and cultural analysis systems in the world. And every single one of them will tell you the same thing. Their technology failed them, but their humanity saved them. Lieutenant Colonel Mitchell stood, followed by the other survivors. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. These weren't theoretical examples, but living proof of Elena's message. What we teach now in the Olive Branch Protocol isn't just a collection of old-fashioned techniques. It's a philosophy of military leadership that acknowledges both the power and limitations of technology. It's a recognition that in the space between system failure and mission completion lies the true test of an officer's worth. Elena's voice softened, becoming more personal. I was once labeled too soft for war because I believed in connection over confrontation, understanding over ultimatums. My approach was dismissed as weakness by those who equated aggression with effectiveness. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. But softness isn't weakness. Empathy isn't capitulation. Understanding your enemy, truly understanding them beyond what your systems tell you, is the highest form of tactical advantage. It allows you to predict what they'll do when your intelligence fails. It gives you options when your technology can't. Elena gestured to the massive view screen behind her, which displayed images of the current Olive Branch Protocol training in action, officers learning both traditional and technological approaches side by side. What you see here is the future of military operations. Not a rejection of technology, but a more sophisticated relationship with it. These officers understand that their advanced systems are tools, not magic. They know that cultural understanding can't be fully digitized, that human intuition can't be completely algorithmed, that judgment can't be outsourced to artificial intelligence. The screen shifted to show graduation statistics from the new program, mission success rates, casualty reductions, conflict resolution metrics. The numbers told a compelling story of improvement across every meaningful category. 2 years ago, when I stood alone against institutional momentum, advocating for methods considered obsolete, I was told I was fighting a losing battle against progress. Today, those same methods have been integrated into the most advanced training in military history. Elena looked out at the graduates one final time. As you leave here today, remember this. Your technology doesn't make you strong. Your training doesn't make you effective. What makes you both is your ability to adapt when they fail you. In that moment, your humanity becomes your greatest weapon. Your capacity to understand, to connect, to find solutions no system could predict. She closed her remarks with words that would be quoted in military academies for years to come. They called me too soft for war until the enemy surrendered to me alone. Not because I was stronger, but because I understood what my technology couldn't. That behind every conflict are human beings making human decisions for human reasons. Understand that, and you'll never truly be powerless, no matter what systems fail around you. The applause was thunderous, a standing ovation that acknowledged not just Elena's words but the profound shift in military thinking she represented. As the graduates filed out to receive their commissions and their olive branch tablets, many stopped to thank her personally. Later that evening, as Elena packed her materials in the now quiet auditorium, General Stone approached. That wasn't the standard commencement address, the general observed with a smile. No, ma'am, it wasn't. 3 years ago, if someone had told me our most celebrated training protocol would be named after a mission that was initially considered a failure, I'd have called them delusional. Elena placed her wooden box carefully in her bag. Sometimes failure is the only path to the truth. The Secretary of Defense was in the audience today, Stone said. He'd like to discuss expanding the olive branch approach beyond the military, adapting it for diplomatic corps, intelligence services, even civilian crisis response teams. Expanding beyond the military? Elena hadn't considered her work having implications outside martial applications. Your core insight, that human judgment and adaptability must be preserved as technology advances, has relevance far beyond our sphere. The over-reliance on systems at the expense of human experience is a problem everywhere. Elena considered this for a moment. I never set out to start a movement, General. I just wanted to prevent more officers from dying unnecessarily. The best movements start that way, with someone trying to solve a specific problem and discovering a universal truth in the process. As they walked from the auditorium into the evening air, Stone added, "By the way, we received confirmation this morning. The last of the 8 missing officers has been recovered. Lieutenant Rivera was found alive, being protected by local villagers. Apparently, he abandoned his technology and used basic phrases he remembered from your training sessions to establish trust. He's being transported home now." Elena stopped walking, momentarily overwhelmed. For 2 years she had carried the weight of those losses, even as her methods gained acceptance. To learn that her teaching had saved even one more life was validation beyond any professional recognition. He said something interesting in his preliminary debrief. Stone continued. He said that when everything failed, he remembered you telling the class that, quote, "connection transcends technology." That phrase kept him alive for 2 years in hostile territory. As the sun set over Fort Concordia, Elena realized that her journey had come full circle. What had begun as a personal mission to prevent the recurrence of tragedy had evolved into something far more significant. A fundamental reimagining of how military forces operated in an increasingly technological world. The officer once deemed too soft for war had transformed military doctrine not through force but through understanding, not through hardness but through human connection. In doing so, she had saved countless lives and changed the definition of strength itself. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.